In the heart of the Montana wilderness, Jack Anderson faces a brutal decision: save a wounded cougar caught in a steel trap, or leave nature to take its course. But when U.S. Rangers, led by the unyielding Captain Mitchell, threaten his freedom for breaking the law, Jack's quiet act of mercy becomes a dangerous rebellion. Yet, in a single moment of unspoken understanding, Jack's defiance shifts the course of everything. But just wait until you see how this fateful choice sparks a thrilling conclusion where justice, however untraditional, ultimately prevails. Jack Anderson had long made peace with the wild, a place where nothing came easily. Living alone in the dense forests of Montana, he had seen the raw power of nature, its beauty and brutality. For years, the forest had been both his refuge and his responsibility. As a trapper, Jack had come to understand the delicate balance between predator and prey, hunter and hunted. The wilderness wasn't a place for weakness. You adapted or you disappeared. There was no room for hesitation, no space for sentimentality. That night, as the wind howled like a mournful choir through the tall pines, Jack felt an uneasy stillness in the air. It was the kind of quiet that crept into your bones, making you uneasy, as if the very land was holding its breath. He was sitting by the fire, the warmth of the flames contrasting with the bitter cold creeping into the cabin, when he heard it. A cry. It was sharp, a sound that didn't belong to the night, the scream of an animal in pain. At first, Jack thought it was a trick of the wind, or maybe the distant call of an owl, but then he heard it again. Louder this time. It was a cry that clawed at something deep inside him, a sound he couldn't ignore. Without hesitation, he stood, grabbing his rifle and the lantern, his heart already pounding. The wind had picked up, but it didn't drown out the terrible wail. It was a cougar, its voice raw with agony, struggling against some unseen torment. Jack's mind raced. He had heard tales of cougars being caught in traps, leg holds that twisted and mangled. The idea of a creature like that, so wild and free, brought low by something as crude as steel. It rattled him more than he cared to admit. His instincts, honed over years of living in the wilderness, told him to stay out of it. The law of the land was clear. A trapped animal was a dead animal. The wilderness could be merciless. It didn't stop for anything or anyone. But this time, something was different. The cry wasn't just a sound. It was a call, a plea for help that pulled at Jack's heart. For a moment, he froze, torn between the harshness of his world and the fleeting compassion that stirred within him. His breath caught in his chest, and memories long buried began to resurface. His own struggles, his own battles with a life that had never been kind. He had fought for survival more times than he cared to remember, and he knew that feeling, the desperation of being caught in something from which there was no escape. For a second, Jack thought about turning back, about letting nature take its course. The forest had its rules, and who was he to interfere? But then he thought of the animal, wild and proud, fighting not just against the trap, but against its own fear. It mirrored a part of him that he'd long hidden, a part that had once fought with everything it had just to keep breathing. Without another thought, he grabbed his tools, the weight of the task pressing down on him. He didn't know why he moved so quickly, why he felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, but he couldn't stop himself. Every step he took toward the cougar's cry felt like a step deeper into his own soul. The wild was calling, and Jack couldn't refuse. Jack's boots crunched against the snow as he approached, the darkness of the forest pressing in from all sides. The cougar, a magnificent creature, was no longer the silent, majestic hunter of the wild. It was now a victim, its strength twisted into something desperate and savage. The metal trap had caught its leg in a vice-like grip, its sharp teeth sunk deep into the flesh, and every movement seemed to tear at the animal's spirit. The cougar thrashed violently, its body writhing in agony, its powerful limbs flailing as it tried to break free. The sound of the animal's struggle was raw, a primal noise that tore at Jack's nerves. His heart pounded as he closed the distance between them, his breath coming fast and shallow, fogging in the cold night air. His hands trembled, not just from the bitter chill, but from the gravity of the moment. He knew this was a dangerous game. A cougar's claws were as deadly as any weapon, capable of tearing through flesh with terrifying speed and precision. He had been on the receiving end of an animal's rage before, and he didn't plan on repeating the experience. Still, he couldn't stop himself from moving closer. The cougar's frantic movements were filled with raw fear, and Jack's instincts told him that an animal in that state would do anything to protect itself. He had to be careful. He had to move slowly, methodically. His voice, soft and low, tried to cut through the animal's panic, each word a silent plea for trust. But the cougar's eyes, wild and filled with pain, made it clear that any mistake could be fatal. His heart raced with a mix of dread and determination as he knelt beside the animal. He had seen this before, the fight to survive, the way the wilderness pressed in on everything, leaving no room for softness or mercy. The cougar's struggle mirrored something deep inside Jack, a feeling he had fought to bury for years. He could see it in the creature's eyes, a mirror of his own fight to stay alive, to find freedom in a world that didn't offer much of either. Jack's hands found the trap's mechanism, cold and unyielding. His fingers were stiff with fear and the cold, but he knew there was no turning back now. With a sharp tug, the trap released. The sound of metal snapping open echoed in the night. The cougar let out a low, guttural growl as it yanked its leg free, blood trickling from the wounds, but there was no time for hesitation. The beast staggered, its movements unsteady, but it didn't run immediately. Instead, it stood for a moment, breathing heavily, its wild gaze locked onto Jack. There was something in that look, something profound. It wasn't just the fear of an animal that had narrowly escaped death. It was something more. The cougar, despite its pain and terror, seemed to recognize the stranger who had pulled it from the jaws of doom. For a long breath, Jack and the cougar regarded each other, separated by only a few feet, two creatures bound by the same struggle for life. Then, with a final, slow glance, the cougar limped away into the shadows, disappearing into the dark heart of the forest, its silhouette swallowed by the trees. Jack stood there, chest heaving, his hands still trembling. The adrenaline surged in his veins, but there was no time to savor the feeling of victory. As he wiped his brow with the back of his hand, he heard it, a faint sound on the wind, the unmistakable clip-clop of horses. His blood ran cold. U.S. Rangers. They were patrolling these parts, and they were known for their strict enforcement of the law. Trapping was illegal here, and Jack had no doubt that they wouldn't be forgiving if they found him. He had broken the law, and the consequences of that could be severe. His mind raced. The cougar's escape had been his only focus, but now a different kind of danger loomed on the horizon. Jack knew the wilderness like the back of his hand, but the Rangers were no strangers to these woods either. They were relentless, and they didn't care for the hard choices a man like Jack had to make. He had moments, maybe minutes, before they'd arrive. His hands still shook, but it wasn't fear for himself that gripped him now. It was the realization that he was about to make another choice. A choice between survival, freedom, and the law that governed this land. The cougar's struggle for life had been his too. But now, in the silence of the forest, Jack felt the weight of the laws that sought to bind him, the freedom he fought for slipping through his fingers like sand. By the time the moon reached its peak, the distant sound of hooves echoed through the still night, cutting the silence like a knife. Jack knew what it meant. The Rangers had come. They always did when someone stepped out of line, when the unwritten rules of the land had been broken. This time it was his turn to face the consequences. He didn't try to hide the blood on his hands. It was there, undeniable, smeared across his calloused palms, a reminder of the life he had saved. The signs of the cougar's struggle, the bloodied trail leading away from the trap, spoke volumes. He could already hear the Rangers circling his cabin, their horses' hooves stamping against the frozen earth, their eyes sharp with suspicion. Jack stood motionless at his window, the glow of the lantern flickering in the darkness. The cabin, his only sanctuary, felt smaller with every passing second. He could feel their gaze, cold, judgmental, unyielding. They were closing in, and there was no escape. He could have tried to run, but it would only confirm what they already suspected. They would find him no matter where he went. It was better to face it, head on. The Rangers were methodical, their movements precise as they positioned themselves around the cabin. There was no noise now, just the occasional snort of a horse and the faint rustle of their jackets in the wind. The night held its breath. Jack waited. Finally, the sound of boots crunching on the snow reached his ears. Captain George Mitchell, the leader of the patrol, was the first to step forward. His silhouette was unmistakable, tall and solid, his face stern and unyielding. He dismounted from his horse with practiced ease, the reins held loosely in one hand. The others hung back, waiting for their commander's orders. Captain Mitchell's eyes met Jack's through the window. There was no surprise, no anger in his gaze, just a quiet acknowledgement of the man he knew Jack to be. They had crossed paths before, under different circumstances, but this time it was different. This time, Jack had done something they all knew was risky, something that would cost him. Without breaking his stare, Captain Mitchell spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the stillness. "You freed the Cougar, didn't you?" Jack stood silent for a long moment. There was no point in denying it. The truth hung in the air like a thick fog. He nodded once, slowly, his face unreadable. He had made the choice. There was no turning back. The captain took a step closer, his expression softening just slightly. The Rangers weren't just lawmen. They were men of the land, too, born of it, shaped by it. They understood the wild, the harsh, unforgiving nature of the wilderness. They knew what it meant to face the choices that came with it. Jack had made a choice, perhaps a misguided one, but a choice driven by the same instincts that guided them all. The wild had a way of calling out to a man, and sometimes that call demanded an answer. For a fleeting moment, Captain Mitchell's gaze softened, his eyes reflecting something deeper than just duty. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. The captain didn't speak further. He simply gave a sharp command. "Stand down," he ordered. The Rangers hesitated for only a moment before they complied. The tension in the air loosened, but it wasn't relief. It was understanding, an unspoken recognition of the reality of the situation. Jack had done what he believed was right, but that didn't mean the law would let him go free. He'd made a mistake, but it was a mistake he would have to live with. As Captain Mitchell turned to leave, his eyes flickered back toward Jack one last time. No words were exchanged, but there was an understanding between them, something that transcended the law. It was the unspoken bond of men who lived alongside the land, men who knew what it was like to fight for survival, even when that fight meant bending the rules. The Rangers didn't say a word as they mounted their horses and rode off into the night, leaving Jack alone once more in the quiet of his cabin. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to exhale. He had done what he could. The consequences would come, but for now, all that remained was the silence of the wilderness, the haunting call of the wild echoing in his heart. And in that stillness, Jack knew, no matter the price, he had made the choice he had to make. By the time dawn's first light filtered through the trees, the Rangers had gone. Their horses' hoofbeats had long faded into the distance, and the silence of the forest reclaimed its dominance. Jack stood alone in the quiet of his cabin, the events of the night still swirling in his mind. He had defied the law, broken a rule that few ever dared to break, but for once, there was no guilt, no regret gnawing at him. The Cougar was free, and in some strange, unexpected way, so was he. The morning air was sharp with cold, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Jack stepped outside, his boots crunching on the fresh layer of frost that had settled overnight. He gazed out into the vast expanse of the wilderness, the towering trees standing like silent sentinels. The world around him seemed to breathe, alive and untouched by the hands of men. And for the first time in what felt like ages, Jack felt a sense of calm. The years had been hard on him. He had lost more than most could ever understand: family, friends, a future he once believed in. The wilderness had always been his home, but it had never been kind. It had taken as much as it had given, and Jack had paid the price. Yet, standing there, with the cold wind biting at his skin and the distant call of birds echoing in the trees, something shifted within him. It wasn't the weight of the law that weighed on him anymore, nor the consequences he would eventually have to face. It was the realization that, for once, he had done something for the right reasons. In freeing the Cougar, he had made a choice to stand up for something: freedom, compassion, the raw, untamed beauty of the world he had come to love and respect. It wasn't a perfect choice, but it had been his. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the moon began its slow rise, Jack found himself sitting on the porch of his cabin, looking out at the forest once more. The pale light of the moon bathed the land in a soft, silver glow, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath, as if acknowledging the fragile peace that had settled over Jack's heart. He thought of the cougar, the way it had looked at him with something almost like gratitude before disappearing into the wilderness. It was free now, a creature of the wild once again, just as it had been meant to be. And for Jack, that freedom felt like a kind of redemption. Maybe not in the eyes of the law, but in his own soul. He had fought for something pure, something beyond the boundaries of rules and regulations. He had spent so many years hardened by the world, driven by survival, that he had forgotten what it felt like to act from the heart. But now, as the moon rose higher and the shadows deepened around him, Jack felt a quiet peace settle into his bones. The world had a way of forgiving, perhaps not always in the ways we hoped, but in its own silent, timeless way. The wilderness had forgiven him for his past mistakes, just as it had done for so many others before him. And in that peace, Jack knew he had found something more precious than anything he had ever sought in his life. It wasn't much, just a small, quiet moment of clarity under the moon's watchful gaze. But for Jack Anderson, it was enough.